Where did you end up falling on is it the big substructural, the imperial competition, masculinity, racism, the arms race? Is it those, or is it contingent? Is it mistakes? Is it timetables? Is it just tiny misjudgments?
The awful thing is, I think it's all of it. You know, because people operate within frameworks. I mean, we are part of a society at the moment. We have certain assumptions, which often we don't examine. You know, we assume certain things are good, certain things are bad. And we're products of our societies. But we also make decisions within those frameworks. And so I think what I tried to do was try and understand the society within which these people operated. And class is very important. You know, if you come out of the upper classes in, say, Austria-Hungary or Germany or Britain, you have a certain set of values. Now, you can rebel against them, you may end up being very different, but you grow up with a certain set of values. So, I mean, so many of those people in key positions in foreign ministries and in the military, in, say, Austria-Hungary or in Germany, came out of those aristocratic backgrounds, were being brave, being prepared to fight, having a strong sense of honor, which they transferred to their countries. You know, they kept on talking about Austria-Hungary's honor and Germany's honor. I think that matters. You know, your class background matters. It really matters, too, in the end. I mean, again, I came to this conclusion by the summer of 1914. It matters who's in power. You know, if you had, let's just take one example, you'd had a different czar in Russia. You had, in Russia, Nicholas II, you had a man who was weak, who was determined to hang on to the Romanov power, who saw any concession to the new forces in Russia, the new democratic forces, new constitutional forces, as weakness, who had been forced to give a constitution and then had spent the next 10 years trying to claw back the powers. This is someone who was weak, but who feared that if he didn't look tough in 1914, people would stop supporting him. I mean, he decided on war, I think, partly because he was afraid of being weak, and I think the same thing was true of Kaiser Wilhelm.
It's funny, this idea, this obsession. Older men, obsessed with honour, very aware of imperial competition, and Brits saying our word will count for nothing. No one will ever. Other people saying no one will ever believe us again. It's about honour. And of course, these old men are also looking over their shoulder, terrified about change in society that might see them and their class swept away from power. The kind of idea of a cleansing war, a war to reinforce traditional values. It's what is it? What's going on within aristocratic masculine culture at that time in Europe?
I suspect there's more uncertainty and insecurity than you might think. I mean, the world is changing around them. You know, if you look at what's happening to the value of agricultural land, for example, across Europe, it's not as valuable as it once was. And many of those big aristocratic and upper class fortunes are based on land. Not all. I mean, the ones who survive have breweries, they have mills, they have factories. But a lot of the wealth among the upper classes is in land, and the value of land is going down. There's a huge amount of land being sold off, transferred, families going bankrupt because they're no longer as rich as they were. It's partly because there's now competition from cheap grains coming in from the Americas and from places like Australia and New Zealand. All those new farming areas are being opened out. And so I think there's a fear that they're vanishing. I mean, if you think of The Cherry Orchard, for example, you know, that wonderful sort of elegiac Chekhov play, it's about dispossession. It's about an old family losing its place. And the last sound you hear, I think, almost is the sound of the axes cutting down the cherry trees, because a new man has bought it and he's going to turn it into a commercial property. So there's that, I think. There's a sense that values no longer fit into the modern world. Things are changing. Because the time before 1914 was also a time of tremendous growth and experimentation and change. And so I think there's something of that. But there's also what you said, that there is this feeling that if we get a good war, it'll bring the nation together. We won't have all these internal divisions, which, you know, we do have. We have different political divisions, different classes, different ethnicities. And it will, so some of them thought, they certainly thought in Germany, in certain circles around the Kaiser, it will give us the excuse to suspend the constitution, get rid of the Reichstag, which we don't like, close down the unions who are troublesome, get rid of the Social Democratic Party. We can go back to some sort of idealized past where, you know, you ruled with an iron fist and the lower classes knew their places. So it's a complex, I think, of ideas and emotions.
And then also what's so interesting about your book, and again we think about this in the era of Trump as well, is the revolution in state power that enabled small groups of individuals to control the lives of just millions of people in this vastly complex way. Send dozens of trains every minute across the bridges of the Rhine into Belgium full of troops, or you know, mobilise these vast armies. It doesn't seem like political institutions and decision making has moved on beyond the days of just William the Conqueror deciding things with half brothers.
It's a very curious combination, isn't it? Because what you have is peoples whose values often represent an earlier type of society, a more agrarian society, a society with perhaps a clearer class structure, in charge of what is an increasingly industrialized war machine. And part of what contributes to the tragedy in Europe and the catastrophe of the First World War is that you have this enormous capacity to produce things, this enormous capacity to organize. Governments have become more and more bureaucratic. Governments are beginning to collect statistics by the middle of the 19th century. They have much more knowledge about society, and bureaucracies have become much more professional. And they also have this huge industrial capacity, and they have this huge network of communications, of telegraphs, of railways, of paved roads. And so the tragedy is, in a way, that you have people in charge, as you suggested, who come out of an earlier thing. They think, I think, a lot of the generals, it's not, to be fair to the generals, a lot of them are beginning to be aware that the world is changing. They're beginning to be aware that war on an industrial mass scale is going to be absolutely hideously expensive. But they've been trained to think of winning wars, and they've been trained to think of the attack. And I think they hope that war will somehow end up like being a war of maneuver, like the Napoleonic Wars. And I think what's really striking is how many of the generals at the beginning of the war collapse and are not there by Christmas. Von Moltke the Younger, the chief of the German general staff, basically has a nervous breakdown and has to be removed. And it happens to a lot of them because they're simply not equipped, and very few people are, to deal with this.
British Corps commander dies on the way to the Western Front.
They have heart attacks, they collapse. And it's understandable because they're under the most terrible pressure.